Hello, I'm Steve Leininger, and today's topic is the role of bonds in your portfolio. And let me emphasize that this really is about the basics. Bonds come in many shapes and sizes, but we're going to deal with the most fundamental principles of bonds. So what is a bond? A debt instrument issued for a period of time more than 1 year. And so who issues bonds? Two kinds of entities issue bonds. The government, that could be the federal government, state, city, or corporations, as represented by this fat cat with cash coming out of his pockets. So a bond will pay interest, a fixed rate of interest, over a period of time. Another fundamental about bonds, which is probably the hardest concept both to understand and to try and explain, but in its simplest terms, generally when interest rates are falling, the value of bonds increases. What you could sell them for versus what you bought them for. Conversely, when interest rates are rising, the value of bonds goes down. The question then becomes, where we are today, will interest rates increase or decrease? And the answer is, we don't know what they're going to do. But they certainly don't have much more room to decrease. Now we get into a lot about what are the ratings of the bonds, because this is an important concept. So the ratings, either by Moody's or Standard & Poor's, is an attempt to rate the quality of the issuer, the likelihood that you're going to get paid back your interest and principal. So if we look at the very highest, AAA, very, very rare that a bond that has a AAA rating will default. On the other side of that, if it's in this lower range, they either are in default or just about to default. So here is the range at which these are considered investment grade and these are considered junk bonds. The other thing to consider is how long is the bond outstanding for? What's its maturity? And we find that if this were the standard deviation of the bonds, meaning how volatile the value is, the longer the term, the longer the maturity, the greater the volatility. But certainly in today's market, the longer the maturity, only a slight increase in the stated interest rate. So in our philosophy of buying bonds, we tend to stay on this side of the maturity curve, something less than 7 years, where the volatility doesn't get too high. So the types of returns you get from bonds are both in their change in value of the principal and the stated yield. So if I were to offer you two different bonds, one is a 3% bond and another is a 6% bond, which is better? We don't know yet. How do we know what accounts for the difference in these two bonds? Well, there's really only three ways that can explain the difference in the yield of these two bonds. One is the quality of the issuer. So obviously this is a high quality issuer because they have to promise me less money in order for me to loan them money because they have a stronger ability to pay me back. Two is the maturity. Perhaps this is a 5-year bond and this might be a 30-year bond. I need to be paid more if I'm going to loan money for a longer period of time. The third one, if these were bond funds instead of individual bonds, the other thing that might explain the difference is the expense ratio of the bond fund itself. So let me give you a hypothetical. In a world where we have JCPenney, IBM Corporation, or the Department of the Treasury, the federal government, and we could loan any of these people money for 4% over 5 years, which entity would we be willing to loan money at that rate for? Which would we choose? If the return was going to be equal, well, the answer is obvious. We'd loan the money to the Treasury because they have the best ability to pay. They're the only ones of these three that can raise taxes. IBM would be number 2 because it's a very high quality company. And JCPenney, if you've been reading the news, they don't know what they're doing, but their rate of returns they have to promise are very, very high. Here's the reality of what these people, for a 5-year bond and a 10-year bond. So JCPenney has to pay 9.9% in order to be able to borrow money for 5 years. For 10 years, they have to pay 8.6%. Contrast that to the federal government. 5 years, they're paying only 0.8% to loan money, and for 10 years, 1.9%. So you can see that the quality of the issuer and the length where you loan the money makes a huge difference in the outcome. Now, if we're comparing bond funds, here's 2 different bond funds. One is the DFA 5-year Global Fund with an average maturity of under 3 years. So, you know, it says 5 years. It's really not 5 years. It's 2.5 years to 3 years. The Vanguard High Yield Fund, notice it says high yield, what they really should say is Vanguard Junk Bond Fund to accurately describe it, is yielding 6.4%. So which is better? And how do we explain the difference? Well, with the Vanguard High Yield Fund, the average rating is in the BB area. The average rating here is AA+. So quality is a big difference. This, I explained, has about a 2 to 3 year average maturity. This has an average maturity of about 10 years, with some of the bonds over 20 years. Now, is this good or bad? It all depends on what you've decided the purpose of bonds in your portfolio is. Where do you want to take your risk? And here's some of those risks that we need to consider. If it's a BAA, which is sub-investment grade, for 5-year bonds, about 10% of those BB bonds default sometime in that 5-year period, and nearly 20% in a 10-year period. When we get down to C, just expect those to default, because that's about what's going to happen. So high-yield bonds, as a class, which includes some of all these, is about 20 times more risky to invest in over a 5-year period. So consider that when we stretch to get a better yield. Now let's look at the cost of diversification too. With government bonds, we don't need to diversify that much because they're backed by the government. As long as it's the federal government, we don't need to diversify very much. If we have state governments or city governments, yes, we'd want to diversify there. With high yield bonds, we want to diversify a lot because the risk of any one company becomes great if we have a small basket of high yield bonds. Here is the real problem with high yield bonds. They have about an 80% correlation to equities in bad markets. And here's where we get to the foundation, the fundamentals of the purpose of bonds in a portfolio. We view bonds in a portfolio as a way to diversify away from the risk of equities. So if I have high yield bonds and they correlate 80% to equities, I haven't diversified away my risk of equities. So let me summarize what we've talked about. Your investment policy statement should clearly reflect what you want the role of bonds to be in your portfolio. Do you want to have them be high risk, or do you want to have them be the low risk part of your portfolio to diversify against the risk of stocks, which is generally how we approach fixed income or bonds in your portfolio. So the takeaways are, when possible, we use individual bonds so that they don't have the built-in expense ratio, no matter how small it is, and we ladder those bonds between 3 and 7 years, so that every year something's coming due and we can take advantage of newer interest rates. If we have to use bond funds, we use very high quality bond funds with a very low expense ratio. So don't confuse strategy versus outcome. Our view is that this is the right strategy for bonds in a portfolio. There will be times when the high yield bonds do very well, but our goal again is to diversify against the risk of stocks. So we want something that will negatively correlate to stocks.